Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is on sufficient assumption questions in the logical reasoning section. So when we're working on sufficient assumption questions, what we want to cover today is how to spot one first. What's the process that you want to take when you're working on a sufficient assumption question? What are the kinds of reasoning structures that are going to be prevalent within this particular question type? And the trap answers that you want to be on the lookout for. So in the logical reasoning section, 57% of all questions are within the assumption family, of which the sufficient assumption question type is a member. And 6% of all logical reasoning question types or questions are sufficient assumption questions. So while it's not the biggest question type out there, it is still a major player. And it's the kind of a question that can really push you ahead because it is considered generally a harder question type. So you spot a sufficient assumption question with language within the question stem itself. Which one of the following, if assumed, enables the conclusion above to be properly drawn? So we're going to assume something to be the case, and it by itself will enable the conclusion to be properly drawn. It will suffice, it will ensure, it will guarantee that the conclusion follows. So that tells you that it's a sufficient assumption question. Or in this case, the conclusion above is properly drawn if which one of the following is assumed. So the word assumed tells you that you're on an assumption question, and then the word if tells you that it's a sufficient assumption, because if is a sufficient condition language cue. And when you pair that word if with the word assume, you're on a sufficient assumption question. Or from which one of the following does the conclusion logically follow? Meaning if you were to add something, it would make it so that the conclusion above follows logically. So this would guarantee that the conclusion follows. This would be a sufficient assumption question. Or which one of the following assumptions enables, again, so assumptions and enables paired together tells you that you're on a sufficient assumption question. Or which one of the following, if assumed, allows? In this case, allows is just like the word ensures or enables or suffices or guarantees. So we're looking at a sufficient assumption question. Assuming the truth of the passage, which we always do anyways, one can conclude from it that something is the case if one also knows. So if we add something else, whatever it is in the answer choice, it's going to make it so that one can properly conclude something to be the case. It will ensure that it's true. So this is a sufficient assumption question. The process that you want to take when you're working on a sufficient assumption question is the same that you take whenever you're working on any question type within the assumption family. First, you need to find the conclusion. Then you need to identify the evidence that's being used to support that conclusion. And then the third step is the hard part, where you need to evaluate the reasoning, meaning you need to judge the argument, figure out whether it's good or bad. And the answer is always that it's bad. But this is the part where you're trying to find the gap in the reasoning. And sometimes your intuition will be enough to take you across the finish line, but sometimes it won't be. And so in those cases, you're going to want to turn to reasoning structures to help you better understand the organization of the argument so that you can perceive the gap. Once you understand the gap in the argument, use that to anticipate what an answer might sound like, and then use that anticipation as you review the answer choices. So the reasoning structure that's going to play the most important role on sufficient assumption questions is conditional logic. 90% of all sufficient assumption questions involve conditional logic. And conditional logic is where you're mapping out the relationships using conditional notation in order to better perceive how the argument is fit together. It kind of works something like you're trying to find the missing link inside of the argument. So let's suppose we have this argument here where they're giving us these premises. They say that A implies B and that C implies D. The conclusion of the argument is like the entire journey. It's like you're trying to get from point A to point D, and they've already built these segments, A to B and C to D. So the assumption is that missing link that will allow you to finish this journey. So in this case, the missing link is if B, then C. So let's see this in a real example. Here's a question. Go ahead and hit pause. Try this question on your own. See if you can find an answer that you like. And then when you're ready to discuss, hit play. Okay, so remember, the first thing we want to do when we're on a sufficient assumption question is to find the conclusion. And in the last sentence, we see the word so. So is like the word hence, is like the word thus, is like the word therefore. They're all indicating that you're about to read a conclusion. So the last sentence represents the conclusion of the argument. And we can represent it in an if-then form or in conditional relationship form by saying if something is a member of Pteropsida, then it does not belong to the family Hominidae. If we look at the evidence, the first premise is that no chordates are tracheophytes. And we can say that if something is a chordate, then it is not a tracheophyte. And then second, we know that all members of Pteropsida are tracheophytes. So if Pteropsida, then tracheophyte. Now, when we're looking for the gap, it's good to start with the conclusion. So notice that Pteropsida is on the left side of the conclusion. It's also on the left side of the second premise. So that is actually a really good sign that we're going to want to start with the second premise and continue from there, and we're going to try to end up at not hominidae. Now, hominidae is not in the evidence in any way. So we know that the assumption needs to build a bridge to not hominidae. Now, the question is, do we want to use both of those premises? Do we want to just use one of those premises? When we look at the right side of both of the premises, we see the opposite term on the same side. So not tracheophytes is on the right of the first premise, and then tracheophytes is on the right of the second premise. So that tells us that we can link these together. And since the term on the left of the conclusion is on the left of the second premise, we want to leave the second premise alone. And let's take the contrapositive of the first premise so that we can link the two premises together. So the contrapositive of the first premise is that if something is a tracheophyte, then it's not a chordate. And then if we reorganize the premises, we take that second premise and push it up above, it'll help us better see the link or the chain of reasoning here. So if something is a Pteropsida, then it's a tracheophyte. And if it's a tracheophyte, then it's not a chordate. So the missing link in this argument is going to be if something is not a chordate, then it's not a hominidae. Or by contrapositive, we might also be looking for if something is a hominidae, then it's a chordate. Either way, that's the relationship that we need to build a bridge. We need to connect so that we can complete this argument. So let's look at the answer choices. Answer choice A says that all members of the family Hominidae are tracheophytes. We're trying to connect H's with C's, while this answer choice is connecting H's with T's. So this is simply an irrelevant relationship. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice B says all members of the family Hominidae are chordates. This looks very much like the contrapositive of the missing link. So let's hold on to answer choice B. Answer choice C says that all tracheophytes are members of Pteropsida. So this is connecting T's and P's. We're trying to connect C's and H's. So this is simply going to be, actually, if we take a closer look, this is actually very much like that first premise. If Pteropsida, then tracheophyte. The difference is that it's reversing the relationship. So this is simply reversing the first premise, not going to help us build a bridge here. If we look at answer choice D, it says that no members of the family Hominidae are chordates. If you were to put this in an if-then form, it would say if something is a Hominidae, then it's not a chordate. But we were looking for if something is a Hominidae, then it is a chordate. So answer choice D, while it's connecting the right terms, it does it in a way that actually undermines the argument. This is weakening it. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice E says that no chordates are members of Pteropsida. So if something is a C, then it's not a P. Or by contrapositive, if it's a P, then it's not a C. If something is a P, then it's not a C. And this actually follows from the first two premises. So if something is a Pteropsida, then it's a tracheophyte. And if it's a tracheophyte, then it's not a chordate. So we could infer from those two premises that if something is a Pteropsida, then it's not a chordate. But if you might pick an answer choice like E if you got confused about what you're being asked to accomplish. E follows from the premises, but it doesn't build a bridge between them and the conclusion. So answer choice E is simply an inference of the stated premises. Let's get rid of it. And that allows us to choose answer choice B with confidence. So another reasoning structure that would be helpful to know about with sufficient assumption questions is the idea of a comparison. 13% of sufficient assumption questions work by ensuring that the comparison that they're creating actually works. So to see how this plays out, let's take a look at a hypothetical example here. Suppose we know that this year, 15% of all stock trades involve fraud, while 10 years ago, only 5% of stock trades involved fraud. Does that mean that more stock trades involve fraud this year than did 10 years ago? Well, maybe. But let's think about this. Let's put some numbers on this. Let's suppose there were 100 stock trades occurring this year and 100 stock trades occurring 10 years ago. Then given that 15% of them involve fraud this year, there would be 15 that involve fraud and 85 that didn't. And if 5% of stock trades 10 years ago involved fraud, then there would be 5 that involved fraud today, or 10 years ago, and 95 that didn't. So under this circumstance, it would show that there are more stock trades that involve fraud than, say, 10 years ago. But this isn't the only case that could occur. Remember, we're just kind of assuming that there were 100 stock trades this year and 100 stock trades 10 years ago. But if that was somehow different, let's suppose there were 20 stock trades this year and 100 stock trades 10 years ago. Then 15% of that 20 would be 3. So there would be 3 that involved fraud this year and 17 that didn't. Whereas if there were still 100 stock trades 10 years ago, 5% of that 100 would still be 5. So under this circumstance, there would actually be fewer stock trades that involve fraud this year than, say, did 10 years ago. So this would actually undermine the idea that there's more stock trades today that involve fraud than 10 years ago. If, on the other hand, there were 200 stock trades that occurred this year, then 15% of that 200 would be 30. And so there would be more stock trades that involve fraud this year than 10 years ago. So what really was important here is the number of stock trades that are occurring within each time period. Even though we know the percentage of them that involve fraud, without knowing the total size of the pie in each year, we wouldn't be able to say whether more or less stock trades actually involve fraud. So to guarantee that more stock trades involve fraud, you would need to say either that there were more stock trades this year than there were 10 years ago, or there were the same number of stock trades that involve same number of stock trades this year as there were 10 years ago. If, however, you were to say that there were less, that would actually undermine the argument. So here's an example question. Go ahead and try this one on your own. Hit pause, see if you can find an answer that you like, and when you're ready to discuss it together, hit play. Okay, welcome back. So remember, the first thing we want to do when we're working on a sufficient assumption question is to find the conclusion of the argument. And in this case, that last sentence that begins with the word obviously is the conclusion of the argument. Now, obviously isn't one of those words that, in my mind, typically represents the conclusion, but it's very common on the LSAT that they use it as an intro to a conclusion. So pay attention to obviously or the word clearly. Those can both be used to help you identify conclusions. And they're saying that less money is being spent now on effective treatments of disease X than was spent 10 years ago. Why? Why is that the case? Well, they say that in the past decade, a decreasing percentage of money spent on treating disease X went to pay for standard methods of treatment, which are known to be effective, though they are expensive and painful. And an increasing percentage is being spent on non-standard treatments, which cause little discomfort. Now, those are two different ways of saying the same thing. Essentially, a smaller percentage is going towards the standard treatments, and a larger percentage is going towards non-standard treatments. And then they go on to label the non-standard treatments as being ineffective, while they told us earlier that the standard treatments are known to be effective. So 10 years ago, let's say 15% of money being spent on treating disease X went towards the effective treatments, and 85% went towards the ineffective treatments. According to the evidence, a smaller percentage is going towards that effective treatments. So let's say it goes down to 5% potentially. Does that mean that less money is being spent now on effective treatments of disease X than was spent 10 years ago? Maybe. That really depends on how much money is being spent on treating disease X overall. If the amount of money being spent on treating disease X has remained the same, then as the percentage going towards the effective treatments declines, so will the amount. Alternatively, if the total amount being spent today on treating disease X declined, then a smaller percentage of a smaller total pie would also be a smaller amount. The only thing that could potentially cause a problem for this argument is if the amount of money being spent on treating disease X actually increased compared to 10 years ago. Then a smaller percentage of a larger amount may not actually be a smaller amount. So with that understanding of the argument, let's go ahead and look for something about the total amount being spent on treating disease X either having remained the same or declined since 10 years ago. If we look at answer choice A, they say that varieties of disease X requiring expensive special treatment have become less common during the past decade. Now, they did tell us that the standard methods of treatment are expensive. They go on to say that an increasing percentage is being spent on non-standard treatments, which cause little discomfort, but they don't talk about the cost there. So are they talking about the standard methods or non-standard methods in answer choice A? It doesn't really say. And so answer choice A is simply too weak to impact the argument here. Answer choice B says that non-standard methods of treating disease X are more expensive now than they were a decade ago. Actually, B seems to be working against the argument. If the non-standard methods of treating disease X are more expensive, then maybe the reason why a greater share of the total amount of money being spent on treating disease X went to the non-standard methods is simply an increase in their cost. And it has nothing to do with a change in the amount of money being spent on the standard methods. So answer choice B actually weakens the argument. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice C says, of total medical expenditures, the percentage that is due to treatment of disease X increased during the past decade. This is not quite the same as saying that the amount being spent on treating disease X increased during the past decade. They're saying that the percentage that is due to treatment of disease X increased during the past decade. So whether you want to see this as too weak or undermining the argument, or maybe even like out of scope, those other treatments that are, we're talking about the treatments of disease X, and those how much money is being spent on other treatments doesn't really matter. So let's just call this one out of scope. Answer choice D says most of the money spent on treating disease X during the last decade went to pay for non-standard treatments. Well, D is talking about how the pie is being split up. Is the amount going towards the percentage going towards effective treatments 15%, or is it 85%, or is it 65%? Like, how do we want to divide this pie? Like, we chose randomly 15% and 5%, but whether we chose 85% and 70%, it still wouldn't have an impact on the argument here. This is, an irrelevant comparison. Like, how that money is being split doesn't really necessarily matter. So let's get rid of it. Answer choice E says that the total amount of money spent on treating disease X slowly declined during the past decade. What this is saying is that the total size of the pie is smaller today than it was 10 years ago. So if we have a smaller percentage of a smaller amount, that would mean that less money is being spent on effective treatments than was being spent 10 years ago. So answer choice E matches our prediction. It's the right answer, and we'll pick it. So let's think about trap answers, the kinds of wrong answers that you're going to encounter when you're working on a sufficient assumption question. 36% of all wrong answers on sufficient assumption questions are wrong because they're out of scope. Those are generally going to be the easier ones to get rid of, right? You want to move through the choices and get rid of as many of the wrong answers as you can on your first pass, while ensuring that you hold on to the right answer and any contenders. So you get rid of the out of scope ones, but then you have other reasons why answer choices can be wrong. So answer choices that simply support the evidence, but don't build a bridge between the evidence and the conclusion. Premise support. 11% of answer choices are wrong on sufficient assumption questions because they're simply restating a premise or supporting a premise. 11% of wrong answers are wrong because they're reversing the relationship, either that you're trying to connect, or let's say of a premise. So it's either reversing a premise or reversing the assumption. Either way, it's not building the relationship in the proper way, so it's wrong. Negations are a different way in which you can restate the relationship in a slightly wrong way. So reversals simply take the relationship and change the direction, whereas negations simply keep the terms on the same side but negate them. They're very similar mistakes, and 6% of wrong answers are wrong on sufficient assumption questions because they're negating the relationship. 3% of answers are wrong because they're irrelevant relationships, and another 3% are wrong because they're using the wrong trigger, maybe even the wrong outcome. Right? Those are a little less common. But when we look at the degree issue, 31% of wrong answers are wrong because they're simply too weak. On sufficient assumption questions, we need to guarantee that the conclusion is valid. So an answer choice that gets close but not quite is wrong. An answer choice can't be wrong for being more than what you need. So an answer choice that's really, really, really strong, but that guarantees the conclusion follows, is perfectly fine. But an answer choice that looks right but isn't quite strong enough to get you all the way there might be tempting but wrong. So pay attention to answer choices that are simply too weak to get you across the finish line. So in summary, you spot a sufficient assumption question with language cues like enables or ensures or suffices, allows, anything that indicates sufficiency within that language cue. And then the reasoning structures you want to be on the lookout for are conditional logic, which is the major player. 90% of all sufficient assumption questions play with conditional logic, whereas only 13% of sufficient assumption questions play with comparison reasoning structures. And the trap answers that you really want to be on the lookout for are ones that are out of scope, too weak to prove the conclusion, those that are supporting the evidence, or those that are somehow mangling the relationship either by reversing it or negating it. So that's it for sufficient assumption questions. I invite you to check out some of these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.